Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here this morning, both here in Boston and for the 130 so participants we have online. We appreciate you joining us this morning. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. For those of us here, the restrooms are down the hall back towards the entrance where we came in. The other thing that I think is important is that we all silence our cell phones for the next couple of hours. That'll be helpful to the panelists and everybody here. My name is Tim Hughes. I'm the Regional Vice President of Sales for the New York, New England region for GDF SUEZ Energy Resources. I'd like to welcome everybody to today's seminar event on electricity and natural gas price risk this fall and beyond. Our keynote speaker is Andy Weissman. Andy is the CEO and publisher of EBW Analytics Group, as well as a senior advisor at Haynes & Boone. Following Andy, Joe Dalton, a Director of Government and Regulatory Affairs at GDF SUEZ, will present on the public policy changes being contemplated in energy markets throughout the ISO New England region by governors, legislators, and regulators. Given the impact of the polar vortex on the energy system this past winter and the anticipation around conditions this upcoming winter, this update is very timely. Joe has more than 20 years of public policy experience, including an exclusive focus on energy issues for the past 8 years. After Joe updates us on changes in ISO New England, Jeffrey Levine will present on potential public policy changes with the New York ISO. Jeffrey is also a Director of Government and Regulatory Affairs. He has over 20 years of energy and environmental policy experience at federal and state levels. He has been with GDF SUEZ for 11 years, focused on retail and wholesale market design and development. Prior to that, Jeffrey spent 9 years in Washington, D.C., where he worked at the U.S. Department of Energy and as a lobbyist addressing federal efforts at electricity market restructuring. We will conclude the presentations with a question and answer session, so we ask that you hold all questions until then. We will have our 3 speakers available, as well as Jeremy Lowe, who has joined us from Houston as our Director of Supply for the New England and New York markets, joining us to help answer questions as well. At this time, I'd like to welcome Andy Weissman up to the podium.
Thanks very much, Tim. I'm really pleased to be here. This is like coming home for me, basically, because I went to school in the Boston area here, and then really for much of my career, I spent more time here than in Washington, D.C., where ostensibly I have my home. I represented back in the old days before competition. I represented many of the regulated utilities in New England and worked on mildly controversial projects like who would pay for the $9 billion for the Seabrook nuclear plant. And then when the move came towards competition, as some of you may conceivably remember, New England was really in the forefront. And I decided I really didn't want to be on the side of defending the status quo, and still I played a very active role both here in Massachusetts and in New Hampshire in trying to open up markets. So I have a fairly long-term perspective on what's happening, and I'm going to try to bring that to bear. As Tim indicated, I have a publication that we distribute through GDF SUEZ Energy that looks in a fair amount of depth in the electricity markets, both here in the Northeast and in all the other competitive markets around the country. In the presentation that I give this morning, really, what we try to do with our consulting group, EBW Analytics, is we try to look at the electricity and natural gas markets in a more rigorous way than they have been looked at historically. We actually have a pretty good track record of being able to consistently predict major shifts in price trends before they occur. Today I'm going to focus principally on New England and New York, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about PJM to provide context, and I'm going to focus really on 4 main issues. 1, the lessons learned from last winter. 2, what we expect for electricity and natural gas prices over the next 12 to 18 months. Thirdly, what we expect longer term. And fourthly, a topic that Joe Dalton and Jeffrey Levine will also be speaking on in greater detail, which is the need to improve the regulatory process here in the Northeast and really nationally. Because as I'll emphasize in the presentation that I give, really in terms of the super high prices that we saw last winter and the very significant risk that we're going to continue to see high prices in the Northeast, at least in my view, as someone who spent his whole career working on regulatory issues as well as market analysis, is that in the end, a lot of the problem is that the regulatory system is not functioning very well. And frankly, from the perspective of large buyers of electricity and natural gas, I think that is a huge concern because until we get the regulatory solutions right, we will continue to have a much higher risk of sustained periods of higher prices and price spikes than at least in my view, we ought to have. And unfortunately, in terms of the way the regulatory process works, I don't see that the improvements necessarily occurring quickly. And further, we have really an especially difficult problem now because we're moving into a period in which they're going to be, already have started to be, and will increasingly be, retirements of existing power plants. And that makes the exposure to high prices even greater than it would be otherwise. And the way we look at the market, and I don't want to sound like a Cassandra at all, and I'm not in particular by temperament, and in particular I've been working pretty closely with GDF SUEZ Energy for about 5 years now, and I've done that in part because I found that these folks really do an excellent job of trying to structure power portfolios that maximize the protection that customers can get under the circumstances. But I do think, frankly, it's a little bit of a scary situation out there, to be very blunt about it. Because when I have a list of risk factors here that I think create greater than normal exposure to very high prices and price spikes. One, for whatever the cause, and people debate what the core cause is, we are definitely seeing an increased frequency of extreme weather events, and those can occur in both directions, sometimes colder than normal in the winter and hotter in the summer, et cetera, sometimes the reverse. But that, for whatever cause, seems to be a continuing pattern. And when you actually look at, we've been spending a lot of time looking at kind of core weather drivers, and there are very unusual things happening all around the globe. If we look at what caused last winter, the polar vortex last winter, a lot of it, believe it or not, has to do with an enormous warm water pool that has developed halfway around the world in the West Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And that actually changes the jet stream flow, and it changed it in a way that kind of opened the door for cold air to come in from Canada. And that warm water pool didn't exist previously. There is no historical analog to it, and it's actually about 2 to 3 times the size of Australia, and the temperature in that water right now is 90 degrees. You could take a bath in it right now without any problem. So that's part of the reality, and that, as we all know from last winter and other periods, when we get those extreme weather events, they can cause severe price spikes. Secondly, I'll talk about this more. Part of what we learned last winter is that the ISOs and RTOs around the country actually didn't do a very good job of assessing how much generating capacity we need for the system to operate well. The third problem, really significant one, is that in part due to Clean Air Act requirements under federal law, and in part due to economics, we're seeing a massive wave of power plant retirements. That's a huge issue and problem. We're also, the fourth one is that we're seeing underlying increases in demand for natural gas for other purposes. And what we're going to see later in the decade, and I'll talk about this in some depth, is kind of an explosive growth an almost unfathomable growth in demand for natural gas in the U.S., which as we go further out into this, partly due to things like LNG exports, and as we go further out in the decade, that's going to be an important risk factor. And I won't go over all the other factors on that list right now, but the bottom line is that we are still at the early stages of a situation in which there are really sweeping changes occurring in the power system in the United States. And at least for the next several years, most of those changes all cut in the same direction. And the direction they cut into is that they significantly increase the risks of periods of high prices and significant price risks. So I think that's very important to be very much aware of. And it suggests to us very strongly that when making power purchasing decisions, that we're in a period now in which it's a mistake to necessarily put the heaviest weight on trying to get the best possible price, that instead, as I think everybody in the Northeast experienced last winter, during the periods in which prices go way, way up, you can pay massive amounts for electricity and natural gas. And so we think job number one really is to be aware of periods in which there's significant upside price risks, and to look at that as something that needs to be managed, that essentially all of our responsibility is to figure out what kinds of purchasing decisions can be made that protect your companies against the risk that prices will go even higher. And that part of the way to do that, we think, is generally to follow a portfolio approach in the sense of looking for favorable opportunities to buy and covering at least a portion of your requirements further out on the curve earlier rather than later to protect against some of the risk factors I'm going to discuss. And we actually think that the timing of today's program I think is actually very good, because there have been some shifts in the weather, the expected weather for the next 4 or 5 weeks or so. And I think we may well see the lowest prices that we're going to see for several months over the next few weeks, and that therefore the next few weeks may turn, and what I mean by that is lowest prices not just for late October and November, but what tends to happen with the forward price curve is that it tends to some degree be affected by what happens very near term with prices. So if we go into a period where near term we have mild weather and prices come down, that will tend to pull down to some degree the prices of the winter month contracts for this coming winter. And it will also, and this is actually somewhat surprising in a sense, because it's not necessarily completely logical, but the way the market reacts is that we'll actually tend to pull down the price curves for later in 2015 and 2016 and beyond. And so if the current weather forecasts are correct, and we enter into a period now where for the next few weeks we have fairly mild weather and spot market prices tend to come down a little bit, it'll tend to make the whole rest of the curve more attractive. And as I'll discuss in more detail later, I think it's very important to be aware of that, because that means the next few weeks literally may be one of the better buying opportunities that exist for some time. So that's kind of an overview of what I'll cover and some of the risk factors that I want to emphasize as part of this presentation. And the last thing I'll say that's kind of a generic nature is basically talk a little bit more about the lens through which my organization views the markets. Because we basically feel fairly strongly that as people who analyze the energy markets, that we and our peers, and there are a lot of good people work in the same area, need to do a better job than we've done in the past. And we're trying in our organizations, as I mentioned, we actually have a pretty good track record of getting it right in predicting prices. But we think essentially that there's an opportunity now to kind of up the game very substantially by using a next generation approach of looking at the energy markets. And part of what that involves is stepping back and looking at the big picture in terms of trying to understand, all the factors that are influencing the market. A second part of it, for the reasons I've already described, is to focus really heavily on risk assessment. And so in the publication we have, Energy Risk Report, every issue we focus in every region in trying to systematically identify the risk factors that could cause prices to spike upwards. Another thing that we think can be done better is that we think the weather forecasts that are generally used by most people to look at the energy markets now are not very good, that they use techniques that are somewhat outmoded. And so we've tried to move to next generation approach to that. And we believe very strongly in the importance of integrating analysis of weather and markets. And I think you'll see the significance of that. And finally, we also put very heavy emphasis on the impact of regulations on prices, which I think a lot of market analysts ignore, and I think that's a problem. So let's dive in and talk in some detail now about the lessons learned from last winter. And I think the first slide is on what we think is lesson number one, that, and I think really to some degree all of us felt that once it became clear that the shale revolution was for real and that we have, at least in the ground, we have huge supplies of natural gas, and that there are huge amounts of natural gas that if they're produced in a timely manner, can be produced at a very low cost, then that obviously is a plus in terms of keeping prices down at reasonable levels. I think we all thought that what that meant, certainly hoped that what that meant is that energy buyers would no longer be exposed to price spikes to quite the same degree than they have in the past. And I think what we really, one of the primary lessons from last winter is that that's was obviously not true last year. And I think for reasons I'll explain, there also is a high risk that many times in the future, sometimes in the future we'll see natural gas prices drop significantly, but one of the core messages of the program today is that even if natural gas prices nationally at Henry Hub are relatively moderate often in the future, that the risk of electricity prices spiking high and the risk of natural gas prices in New England spiking high will remain very high. And in a sense, it's that, if I had to point to one fact that demonstrates that there's something that's not functioning well about the regulatory system in particular, that's it. Because if you look, we have this very low-cost resource that's available, and I think there was a lot of reason for that, for us, all of us, to hope that that would keep prices moderate, but it hasn't, and often in the future, at least for the rest of the decade, it still won't keep prices low. In a sense, that's a kind of it won't keep electricity prices low, and that's kind of a paradox. I mean, if you've looked what happened on the natural gas supply side, what's happened is, it's almost like a miracle. I guess I was about to wander, but I ought to ask the cameraman. I suspect I probably need to stay put for the portion of this as is being videoed. So I will put my hands on the podium and try to prevent myself from wandering to the screen. But if you look at the graph on the left, that's showing the increase that's occurred in shale production in the United States since, I think that goes from looks like it's 2008 or 2009. I had my cataracts removed recently, but it's not quite good enough for me to make out the 2009. And the growth that's occurred is phenomenal. It's literally, I don't think anyone in the country would have anticipated even 4 or 5 years ago that we'd have growth of this in production that's of this magnitude. And as probably all of you are aware, if you look at where the growth has occurred, the largest segment is that gray area on the graph. And that's right here, in the Northeast region, more broad, at least broadly defined. That's basically in Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania and West Virginia and Ohio. And there's also starting to be a fair amount of growth in Utica, which is in the same basic area. And we have already seen, essentially, shale gas is now accounting for more than 40% of total natural gas production in the United States. And we've seen just in the past 2 years, in the past 4 or 5 years, we've seen an increase in production of 20 BCF a day, which is almost 30% of total U.S. demand. And it really is kind of almost unfathomable. And part of what we've seen, certainly, there's nothing like that. We've never anywhere in the United States, certainly, has there been that kind of rapid growth in energy supply. And I haven't looked systematically around the globe, but I'm not sure there's ever been any incidents anywhere in the world where there have been this many BTUs that have been created from scratch in so short a time period. And what's driving that, if you look at the graph at the right, is technology. And what that is, that's some graph on the right is some EIA, some Department of Energy Information Administration data on the production per month for drilling rig. And what that's showing you is, if you look at the period from 2000 to 2014, there's been a more than 500% increase in the amount of natural gas that's produced by the drilling that you can do with one rig in 1 month. If you think of how many, we've seen tremendous improvements in industrial efficiency in almost every sector of the economy over the last 15, 20 years. But how often do you get a 5-fold increase, actually 6-fold increase in production from your equipment in a period of just 4 or 5 years? There are a lot of things that are going on here, but essentially what that graph is showing is there's been a really dramatic increase in efficiency over this time period. And we have seen, and this is part of the irony or the paradox of last winter, we've seen what that could do with respect to prices. The graph on the right, prices for natural gas, the graph on the right is showing you what the prices for natural gas have been in the non-winter months in Marcellus Shale over the last couple of years. And as you'll see, right now with the black line, we've been seeing prices in Marcellus Shale that have natural gas prices that have been under $2 per million BTU. Now that's in part because some of that gas is trapped in Marcellus Shale. There are not enough pipelines to take all the gas that's produced in Marcellus Shale and ship it to the Northeast, to New England and New York, or to other parts of the country. But it's also because we've had this spectacular increase in Marcellus Shale alone. We've gone from pretty much a standing start to production now 15 BCF a day. So part of the irony of last winter is here we have, for a long time, electricity prices were driven principally by natural gas. And in the presentations that I've given for SUEZ, which I've been doing for about 5 years now, often I focused almost exclusively on natural gas prices because that was such a huge factor driving the market. And in particular, I focused on what was happening with natural gas prices nationally. And here we have this paradox that's occurring now, where we have these really abundant supplies of natural gas, and we still are seeing what we saw last winter. And so, I will now try to dive into what reconciles this. And I think just as background, I think everyone in the room is probably painfully aware of this. But essentially, if you look at what happened in the past prior to last winter, we did have occasional price spikes for both electricity and natural gas throughout the Northeast in PJM, NISO, and ISO New England. But they occurred relatively quickly. Really, if you look at the bottom graph, in PJM and NISO, if you look across the gap, the bottom graphs you'll see with hub prices for natural gas in those regions, you only have a few times over a period of 4 or 5 years where prices spiked to high levels. And what high levels meant was very, very briefly. In 2013 in PJM, it meant something like $13 was the price spike. And NISO, somewhat similar. New England, we already saw prior to last winter somewhat more frequent price spikes and higher prices, but we still were talking about, even on the very worst days, prices that were only about half of the worst day last winter. And then if you look upwards at the top row, that's kind of paralleled with electricity prices, where it was only infrequently that we saw prices in the $150 or $200 level per megawatt hour, even in New England. And last winter, that obviously changed tremendously. And the question is why? And the bottom line in terms of where I'm going to head with the next several slides is basically there's no question that it was in part because we had a very cold winter, but that is not by any means the only factor. And indeed, quite to the contrary, when you look at some of what's the factors that are changing in the power markets today, from the work we've done, it's quite clear that this coming winter, that even if the weather is much closer to normal than it was last winter, that the exposure to price spikes will be at least as great as it was last winter. And the fundamental reason for that, the single most important factor that's driving that, is the retirements of power plants that have already been occurring between last winter and this coming winter. And probably most of you are familiar, there are basically two major retirements that are affecting the New England market. One relates to the Salem Harbor plant that's really basically just up the coastline. And actually I remember fondly, because I did work relating to the Salem Harbor plant a number of times earlier in my career. And then the other retirement, which is his Vermont Yankee, not quite gone offline at this point. Is it still operating for another few weeks, I guess, before we get to the retirement date, if I remember correctly, the exact status. But Vermont Yankee, the nuclear unit in Vermont, has been a core part of the power supply in New England for a very long time, and as probably all of you are aware, it's about to be permanently shut down. And the loss of those two power plants, is enough, essentially, to say that if the winter weather in New England this coming winter is 10% milder than last winter, we're still likely to have just as many price spikes because we have less resource available to serve the load that exists. And unfortunately, that's just the beginning, because as many of you are probably also aware, there are a number of other retirements that are scheduled to occur over the next few years. And every time that there's more generation retired, basically what that will tend to do is to increase the risk of price spikes in New England and create a situation where increasingly every year we'll get a high number of price spikes, even if the weather in the winter is exactly normal, or as we get further out in time, even if it's a milder than normal winter. So this is a huge shift that's occurring in the market, basically because we have, to oversimplify just a little bit, and I'm going to go into more detail later, we have less resource available to serve the demand. So let's go back and let me start from the top down as to what happened last winter. What this graph is showing, this slide is showing, is really two things that are significant. I want to make sure I get the numbers exactly right. But it's showing, the first thing it shows, if you look at the bar chart on the left, is that it's showing that last winter was extremely cold. Essentially what that bar chart is showing, and it was extremely cold over a large part of the United States. What that bar chart is showing is that it's showing the total space, our estimate of the total space heating demand nationally. And last winter is the bottom bar. And you can see that the amount of space heating demand nationally last winter was much greater even than in the winter before. And the winter before was pretty close to a normal winter nationally. And that difference in space heating demand between those two winters is about 800 BCF of natural gas. That's a huge amount. And the way energy markets always work is that energy markets are exquisitely sensitive to the balance between supply and demand. So when we had this kind of increase in winter demand, it created a much tighter market nationally, and it had a predictable effect on natural gas prices. And if you look at the right, the graph to the right, that shows you prices at Henry Hub, and you can see that last winter prices at Henry Hub, that's price for the front month natural gas contract, got over $6 during the month of February. And spot market prices at Henry Hub were even higher for many weeks during the middle of the winter. And there's no question that in terms of the increases in prices for natural gas that occurred nationally, that the core cause of that was that we had very cold weather, and that also we actually had somewhat less natural gas in storage than we had in some earlier winters. So that's one lesson from that graph. But there's also a second lesson that I think is extremely important in terms of what might happen with the energy markets in the future. And that is, if you look at all three bars on the left, those are just showing space heating demand for the last 3 winters. And as you may recall, the last 3 winters were a kind of extreme contrast. The winter of 2011, 2012 was milder than normal. Then we had a normal winter, and then we had a very cold winter. But just between, over a period of 3 years, winter demand swung by almost 2 trillion cubic feet over just the winter period, just those 5 months. And essentially, the reason I think that's important to understand is that shows you that shows you just how sensitive natural gas demand is to winter weather. And it also, that factor more or less guarantees that there's kind of inherent in the natural gas market a great deal of price volatility, because no one can predict what's going to happen in any given winter with any accuracy until you get well into the winter. And natural gas is difficult to store. We do have underground storage capacity, but it's very expensive, and so the amount of natural gas we can store is somewhat limited. And that combination of factors means that even now, from that, if you look at any one year to the next year, that there's a huge amount of inherent uncertainty as to what's going to happen with natural gas prices, and that will have at least some effect on electricity prices, and that's just built in that's caused by our being in a situation even now where the weather makes a huge difference. And reason I dwell on this is that what we're going to see as we go further out in time is that the sensitivity of the natural gas market and the electricity markets to swings in weather is going to go way up, which means if we look down the road, there's going to be way more price volatility. This, I think most of you are familiar with, just shows you how high prices climbed last winter. The top row shows you the severity of price spikes, and we're talking about much higher prices. In New England on the peak days, it got over $400 per megawatt hour, and something that had really never previously been seen in winter months. If you look at the graph below that, that's showing you the prices of the day-ahead market by month. The dark blue bars show you the kind of prices we have, and that in turn has affected futures prices as well. What caused that? I think both Joe and Jeffrey are going to talk about that in somewhat more detail. But there really were three factors that caused the price spikes that occurred throughout the Northeast last winter. One, there's no question the very cold weather was a factor. Two, especially in PJM, another critical factor was the number of power plant outages that occurred when the weather was very cold. And third, and the key factor, was that basically we've known in New England for many years that essentially on days in which temperatures were very cold and there was very high demand for natural gas for space heating, that the pipeline capacity bringing natural gas into New England wasn't going to be sufficient to both meet all the space heating demand and keep all the gas-fired power plants running. And that's exactly what happened throughout the Northeast last winter, and that caused some pretty severe price spikes in both the natural gas market and the electricity market, because essentially there just wasn't enough natural gas available to meet all the needs. That meant that the local gas companies had to bid against the power plant operators to see who would control the gas that was available. The LDCs, the local gas companies, are always going to outbid. They're always going to pay whatever they need to, because as they will tell you correctly, the LDCs, the local gas companies, are the companies that are responsible for making sure nobody freezes to death, and that is real. There have been times around the country where there hasn't been sufficient gas service and the pilot lights go out and you don't get them all lit back on again, and some people freeze to death. And fortunately, it hasn't occurred frequently, but it has occurred, and it could occur if the local gas companies don't have enough natural gas. So they will pay whatever's necessary. That in turn will force up natural gas prices, and it also on very cold days will create a situation where you can't operate all the gas-fired plants, at least using gas. You have to either switch to oil, which gets to be very, very expensive and drives prices very high, or you might be in an even worse situation where essentially you have to resort to even more extreme measures to keep from having to institute blackouts. And that combination of factors is what drove up prices. I think I've already talked through this. If you look at the next slide, part of what that's showing is essentially not only did we have high prices last winter, but what that did in both New England and New York is it drove the futures curve out many years in time much higher, because essentially last winter was a sea change. Last winter taught the country for the first time that essentially there's much greater exposure to price spikes in the winter than anyone thought previously. And so more or less rationally, the futures prices for electricity went way up, going out many years in time. And they've generally stayed way up. If you look at ISO New England on the left, look at the black line in particular, which is this coming winter, you'll see that they're not quite at their peak right now. They've come down. At their peak, they were actually slightly higher than the average price last winter, which is the dashed line, and they've come down a little bit, but not much. And if you look at where they are compared to where they were prior to the start of last winter, they're roughly 50% higher than they were at the start of last winter. And that creates a really tough situation for everybody in the room. It creates a particularly tough situation for anyone who's not yet covered their requirements for this coming winter. But even for people who have fully covered all their requirements for this winter, to the extent you still have uncovered requirements for the next winter or the next winter or the next winter after that, there is continuing exposure to price spikes. And it makes the jobs of everybody in this room and everybody who's listening in by the webcast considerably more difficult because it is a hard choice when prices are already high as to whether you bite the bullet and take prices as they exist or hope that things will get better. And the bottom line of what I'm going to say during the remainder of my presentation is it possible that prices this coming winter will actually be softened somewhat? Sure. It's always going to be possible because it's always possible that we'll wind up having a very mild winter. Is it wise to remain exposed to spot market prices this winter or over the next several winters? My answer to that would be absolutely not. That essentially, for reasons I'll try to detail, that the risk of price spikes remains very high, and there are still scenarios in which prices could go significantly higher than last winter. Am I predicting that they will go higher than last winter? I'm not quite saying that. I'm saying that's a real significant risk, and that if, from my perspective in trying to manage risk, I would definitely not want to be exposed to that risk. I would not want to be exposed to that risk for this coming winter, and I'd be probably at least as concerned or more so for future winters. And so if you're still exposed for this winter, absolute minimum, my advice would be to cover some pretty substantial percentage of your requirements. And if you really want to gamble on what the weather will be, you can leave a little bit still exposed and maybe you'll benefit on that, but I would definitely not want to be in a position where you're fully exposed to what could happen this winter. And if you're looking further out in time, I would say look for favorable buying opportunities and follow a portfolio approach and start covering at least some significant portion of your requirements further out in time to minimize your risk exposure. And what's the risk exposure? I've tried to detail it briefly here. What I think, I'm going to explain this kind of at a broad overview level, and then I'm going to give some more specifics. But what do I think we really learned from last winter? A lot of it is that I think essentially we, the data that was put out by the ISOs and by a number of market analysts, I think reflected some analytical flaws that tended to underestimate the risk of price spikes. Why is that true? Let me give at least a few examples. I won't necessarily go through all of these. But the first one is the way that all the power planners around the country look at the adequacy of power side supply is they do what really is a very simplistic calculation of what's called reserve margin. They look at their projections of the highest, what demand might be on the days of highest demand. And then they compare that to the total amount of generation. And they recognize that on any given day, there probably will be some power plants that won't be operating, whether it's planned maintenance or just power plants trip all the time. They're complex pieces of machines. machinery, and they can go offline in an instant at any point, and usually there almost always are at least some power plants offline. And so they ask how much, if you compare the peak demand to total generation, how much paper excess is there? And they'll say, let's say, to make it simple, that if there's a 15% excess on paper, that adequately accounts for the possibility that some power plants will be, at any moment in time, will be offline. The problem is that doing just that is clearly wrong. It's clearly insufficient. And the reason it's clearly insufficient is for two major reasons. One major reason is that it fails to take into account what are called correlated risks. It looks at what the outage rate is typically over a period for 10 years. And it says if a power plant is typically down 50 days over a 10-year period, that gives you the forced outage rate. Well, the problem is that when you get either very cold weather in the winter or very hot weather in the summer, that affects the operation of power plants, and they are more likely to go offline. And at least prior to now, no power planner in the country has adequately taken that into account. They've done their calculations in a way that was just wrong. And the second factor that's even more important is that the way power planning has been done from the beginning in time until at least now is that they've just assumed that the natural gas will be there for the natural gas-fired power plants. And that we saw in spades last winter just as a false assumption. And the regional planners PJM in particular has publicly acknowledged this before FERC. They just didn't adequately think all that through. And they're beginning to recognize it now, but it's probably going to take several years before they change what they do sufficiently to protect against those problems. And the effect of that was huge. And if you look at the other major problems that exist, the other factor that's critical is to take into account three other factors that could increase exposure to price spikes in the future. And one we know will happen, which is that we know a lot of coal plants, some nuclear plants, and some older steam generating units will be retired. And on the one hand, the planners know that and they take that into account, but those retirements exacerbate the problems I've just described. The second factor is that what we've been seeing that isn't talked about much is that there's been significant growth in demand for natural gas for space heating all around the country and consistently all around the country. And what that does is it exacerbates this problem that I described previously, where if you don't have enough pipelines coming into New England to serve space heating demand and power requirements simultaneously, and the space heating demand is growing, that leaves even less gas available for the power plants. And they've not been taking that into account. And the third factor is nuclear outages, and when I think both of New England and New York and look at potential risks down the road, last winter, actually the nuclear plants performed pretty well. They were generally in service. And I mentioned previously, I spent 3 or 4 years of my career, it's a while ago, but 3 or 4 years of my career working on issues pertaining to the Seabrook plant. And I've also worked on most of the other remaining nuclear plants in New England. And they were up and running almost all the time last winter. We don't know for sure that that will be true again this winter or the next winter or the next winter after that. And if any of those nuclear plants go down in the winter months, and they've generally been well run, but they're getting older, and even the best run plants occasionally go offline. And if they are out of service during periods of very cold weather, the price exposure here in New England will be huge. So, we've got all these factors that I think from my standpoint, some of them are are taken into account in the planning process. Others are only now beginning to be recognized as part of the planning process. But if you look big picture and look at all of them combined, they mean there's some very major risk factors that have only been partially taken into account in the way planning is done. And what that says to me, if I'm in the shoes of a buyer, is that, hey, whatever the ISO says, that the risks may be greater than are initially apparent. They're making some assumptions that may be reasonable most of the time, but may or may not actually be valid for this coming winter. And that increases the risk factors significantly. Now, let me just make sure I think I've got one slide just slightly out of order. So let me apologize for skipping back and forth. This is probably the single most important slide. It's raised the point briefly before, but if you look at the slide on the left, this is actually showing what the exposure is to pipeline congestion and price spikes in New England in the future, and it's showing the importance of retirements. It's a little bit complex, but it's very important. The bottom line is very simple. The bottom line is that as more and more power plants retire, and as demand for natural gas for space heating in New England continues to increase, the likely number of days of price spikes is going to keep going up and up and up. And that's going to be true even if the weather is not as cold as it was last winter. So if you look at the gray bars, graph on the left, gray bars, those are showing you the numbers of days at the last winter, the number of days in each of the last 5 winters in which this problem occurred, where you couldn't get enough gas into New England to serve both space heating demand and power demand. And if you look, it varied, the gray bars vary from year to year. 2010, it was roughly 35. 2011, it was much higher. That's the winter of 2011, 2012. It was much higher, but there was, natural gas prices were very low, and space heating demand wasn't as high yet. We then had a couple of years in which it was mild, and then the gray bar for 2014 is showing what it was last winter. What the blue bars say is they say, let's go back and let's calculate what would have happened if we had exactly the same weather as in each of those winters. But we also were in a situation where Salem Harbor and Brayton Point and Vermont Yankee were no longer operating. And what they show you, if they look at the blue bars, is that 4 out of 5 years, the predicted the number of days of price spikes that we would have had if Salem Harbor and Vermont Yankee were not operating is actually higher than it was in last winter. And that's true even in winters where the temperatures were much milder than they were last winter. There's just less resource available to serve load. And what the graph on the right does, and remember, for this coming winter, Salem Harbor and Vermont Yankee will not be operating. So the reality for this coming winter is going to be the reality of the blue bars, not the reality of the gray bars. And if you look at the graph on the right, that shows you what happens when some of the other retirements that are planned in future years occur. And what that shows you is the way things stand now, that essentially the number of days of predicted price spikes will be higher than it was last winter every year, even under a whole range of different scenarios regarding winter weather. And that is the core of the problem that exists in New England. And that's why we think it's critical to take, to the extent you've not already done so, to take actions now to limit your exposure to price spikes. Now, let me just, because I only have a couple of minutes left, let me talk a little bit about the longer term trends. And these profoundly concern me. I've had discussions just over the last month or two with some key officials in the federal government. Jeffrey Levine, who's here, used to be a key official in the federal government. Earlier in his career, I would have gone to him for him to help, to him for help if he were still there. There's some very good people there now, and I've discussed with them these same issues. Because essentially, if we look further out in time to 2017, 2018, 2019, there are even more things changing. They're very dramatic, and in my mind, they very dramatically increase price risks. So what are they? One is we're still going to have the problem of cold winters. Two, there are reasons to think that natural gas prices will go up significantly later in the decade, even though we have enough supply. Third, we've got problems due to coal retirements, and let me just skip to the fifth one. We've got a situation where it's likely to take years before some of the flaws in current regulations are fully corrected. Let me focus in particular on issues pertaining to natural gas first. What this is showing you, if you look at the graph on the left, is that there is a huge change coming. And what that change is that up until now, even with the shale revolution, demand for natural gas has only grown relatively modestly. If you look at the latter part of the decade, starting in 2017 and even more 2018, 2019, and 2020, we're going to see unprecedented growth in demand for natural gas. And this growth in demand, what it is essentially a delayed reaction to the shale revolution. And we were, some of us were talking last night about a presentation I put on for GDF SUEZ Energy in Philadelphia, I think a good 4 or 5 years ago. And at that point, the shale revolution was still new. And there was a lot of debate over whether it was for real and whether natural gas prices were going to move down to a lower level on a sustained basis. And it took a while before, big potential users of natural gas decided that we'd had enough experience with shale so that it was reasonable, so that we could be confident that there were, in fact, abundant supplies and that the production costs were low. And so it took until 2013, 2014 before a number of different potential users made decisions to move forward and build new facilities that use natural gas. And those facilities, in turn, take several years in order to get completed. But what that graph is showing is that once we get into the latter part of the decade, we're going to see in many different areas, we're going to see the results of those decisions that were made 2 or 3 years ago to build new facilities. And they're all going to occur at once. And so what you've got is, one, the single most important driver is LNG exports, and that is enormous. The scale size of LNG exports is, a typical LNG export project is about the same size as 20 power plants, and power plants burn enormous amounts of natural gas. And at the same time, you're likely to see explosive growth in exports of natural gas to Mexico. And at the same time, you're going to see all sorts of coal plant retirements due in part to laws that were enacted a while ago that are going to go into effect as early as this year, and in part quite possibly to the Obama administration's carbon rule, which could have a major effect. And what's going to happen, those are all going to do several things. One, there's going to be enormous pressure on natural gas supply. And even though the gas is there in the ground, the likelihood is that with demand growing this rapidly, that there will be a period of several years in which growth in demand will outstrip supply. And that will be a real problem because there could be a period of years where natural gas prices are much higher. And secondly, these various different uses for natural gas will result in much higher price volatility. Many of these uses are all potentially affected by weather. So in addition to having the swings that we saw over the last 3 winters, we'll have, due to differences in weather in the United States, we may see massive swings in LNG exports, based in part on weather other parts of the world. We also may see massive swings in pipeline exports to Mexico, et cetera. And all of those will increase price volatility. So what can you do? Let me just get to the right place on this for one last slide. And I'll go back to the one I skipped over. What I mentioned before is that we think a key under these circumstances is to look for potential buying opportunities. And that includes potential buying opportunities for this coming winter, and it includes for your requirements for this coming winter, and includes potential buying opportunities looking out to what your requirements might be a year from now or 2 years from now, or even as long out as 5 years from now. And as I mentioned, essentially, the forward curve, if you think about it, what happens this winter probably won't have much effect on prices 3 years from now. But in fact, if you look at the way the price curves behave, during periods in which we have relatively mild weather, the whole price curve going several years out in time tends to go down some. And so what we think is very important, and one of the key messages for today, is that it looks like what we're going to have is a period where the winter could be fairly cold. And once we get to the winter, prices could go back up significantly. But near term, for the next 30 days, our best prediction of the weather is what's shown on those 3 maps. The first map is 6 to 10 days from now. The second map is 11 to 15, and the right hand is 30-day forecast. And the message is simple. What you've got is a likelihood that we're going to have some pretty warm weather over most of the United States for the next 4, 5, 6 weeks. May then turn very cold by the winter, but for the next 4, 5, 6 weeks, we're going to see a sustained period of, we may well see a sustained period of very mild weather. And I would therefore, to the extent that you have requirements really for the next several years that are not yet covered, I would watch that weather very, very, very closely. Because if it develops the way we think it will, prices are likely to soften, not dramatically, but enough so that it matters. And if they soften, our recommendation would be prepared to act very quickly and take advantage of that buying opportunity before the winter starts. So let me stop there and just hand the microphone over to Joe. Both Joe and Jeff, I think, have some fascinating comments, so I'm really, really, really eager to hear what they have to say.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Andy, so much for an excellent presentation and for really giving us an excellent high-level overview. I'm just going to pull up the beginning of my presentation here. Again, my name is Joe Dalton. I am the Director of Government Affairs here in the Northeast for GDF SUEZ Energy North America. Folks sometimes ask, what does that mean? And essentially, I describe myself as a universal translator. I basically try to describe the goals and objectives of our company to government officials, and in turn describe the workings of the government and the regulatory processes for our company. Again, I welcome everyone in the room. We're filming in front of a live studio audience. Unfortunately, there's no laugh track, as you can hear the very quiet murmurings of giggles. And we welcome again our web audience. Look forward again to your questions at the conclusion of our presentations. So with Andy's high-level overview, I thought what I would do in New England, which is the area I cover most closely, is just kind of drill down into some of the policy decision-making that's taking place. Some of it has made the headlines. Much of it has, because energy has very much been a focal point this past winter, certainly, and I think heading into this coming winter. So basically, I'm going to look back a little bit, because really for much of what's happening in our region, the discussion began in earnest a couple of years ago. I'll then give a natural gas snapshot, move through to some of the many proposed gas and electric transmission projects that will be serving the region, give you a quick snapshot of where I think folks are amongst the stakeholder groups, and just a few concluding thoughts. So a lot of words on this slide, but there's been a lot going on since, as I said, in August of 2012, really, New England became a focal point for federal and local policymakers and regulators. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission actually held a technical conference on the coordination of gas and electric industries here in Boston in that month. Shortly thereafter, in October of that year and through May of 2013, stakeholders kind of created an ad hoc group called the New England Gas Electric Focus Group, which formed and met monthly, and really was designed to be kind of an information sharing opportunity, so that the gas industry could learn a little bit more about the electric industry, and the electric industry could learn a little bit more about the gas industry. A local Connecticut local distribution companies, the New England Power Generators Association, and the president of the New England States Committee on Electricity served as the three chairs of that effort. In September of 2013, that New England States Committee on Electricity, which is basically a body that consists of Department of Public Utility chairs from each of the 6 New England states as the kind of governing body. They had decided that they were going to look at these issues and study them. They hired the firm Black & Veatch to do a series of studies. Their phase 3, or their final study, was released in September. Natural gas infrastructure and electric generation: proposed solutions for New England. Based on that study, the 6 New England governors, and this again is something you may have heard more about, announced in December of 2013 that they were committing to a regional cooperative agreement to procure large quantities of transmission to bring Canadian hydro in, as well as natural gas pipeline infrastructure. And over the ensuing 6 months or so, they solicited stakeholder comment and tried to shape the program. And the novelty of the program, really, on the natural gas side, was they were going to use an electricity tariff to kind of socialize the cost of pipeline procurements. Again, in addition to the FERC, the Department of Energy is very interested in the happenings of New England. So in April of 2014, the Department of Energy came and is doing a quadrennial energy review. So they visited New England with meetings in Rhode Island and Connecticut. Secretary Moniz was here. And so the states were moving along with some speed, and in July, on July 31st, the Mass Legislature actually failed to enact the Clean Energy Resources Bill, which had the effect of really slowing down the process by which the states were moving forward on their joint procurement. The legislation in Massachusetts would have permitted the electric distribution companies to contract for up to 2,400 megawatts of hydro transmission, and would enable Massachusetts participation in this regional procurement. As a consequence, Massachusetts actually paused their participation in the regional initiative. In August, they announced that. And the Department of Energy Resources has started a study on a low natural gas demand growth scenario that's currently underway. It started on the 15th. There's a meeting on Thursday and a follow-up in November. But the other 5 states continue to kind of work on these issues and think about them. And in September, October, November, as many of you are very well aware, the basic service, default service rate announcements have been coming out from the various utilities. Those default service rates are up sharply, and we have announcements pending from some of the other major utilities. So the press, picture paints 1,000 words. They've really kind of crystallized the issue in their minds anyway, as you've got this abundant resource just to our west. As it comes in, it's barely able to produce a trickle for New England. And so that has somewhat been reinforced by ISO New England, which is the regional transmission authority, and they're responsible for the rules and regulations of the competitive wholesale market. And they have basically linked the price of natural gas directly to the price of electricity. And specifically over these past 2 winters, you see these spikes here in New England. So we have a different perspective, a little bit different perspective on natural gas issues. In the interest of full disclosure, our company also owns the District Gas LNG receiving terminal. And so, we look at these infrastructure issues broadly. From our perspective, we find ourselves in this paradox where New England's challenge is actually due to low-price gas. For most of the year, gas prices are very low, and essentially they drain the pond for non-gas-fired generators. Baseload LNG, that is LNG that had customarily been brought in to serve on a day-to-day basis, really doesn't exist in the marketplace in the way that it used to, because folks are able to access low-cost pipeline gas for the majority of the year. And what's happening now is there is competition between gas for power generation and home heating during very short periods during the wintertime. But it's become more acute as our generation mix in New England leans more heavily on natural gas. Heating load maintains a distinct advantage in this competition because basically those contracts are made long in advance. So you will notice on your home bills, for those of you in our region, that your gas bill probably won't go up a whole lot as compared to the past couple of years. But the gas that's being sold for power generation in the futures market tends to be at a higher level. So there's going to be a bit of a disconnect. You'll hear about high gas prices. It won't necessarily come over on your gas bill. And this gas price behavior illustrates a challenge that the additional supply is really only necessary for just a few days out of the year. It's plentiful and cheap most of the time. And that's basically illustrated in this graph, which is gas daily pricing response. You'll see the green is where these days are less than $5, and the red lines, the few red lines, are where the price jumps up over 15. So again, building additional regional pipeline infrastructure generally can't be supported given the short duration of the problem. And this is another illustration of kind of what's going on. Over the last 4 winters, gas demand in New England has actually been within the existing pipeline capacity. So even with an extended cold spell, the demand increased such that the total pipeline utilization was above 90% on 42 days and above 95% on just 10 days. And as pipelines reach their limits, the spot prices increase. But a relatively small amount of gas in this circumstance can have a disproportionate effect on relieving stress throughout the system. And you notice the problem clearly was more acute this last winter period where there was a significant price impact. So we often hear about this, our market, and Andy talked about a number of the retirements, and a lot of that is continuing with Brayton, Salem, and Vermont Yankee. The power mix is heavily dependent on natural gas now and is expected to be even more so by 2020. We have nearly 7 gigawatts of retirements, but we have a lot of activity in the auctions, the forward capacity market auctions, which is producing a clear investment signal. So a number of folks are interested in coming into the market, and our new build and generic new build gets up and nearly closes the gap in that setting. And so basically, what we're seeing is the congestion that exists actually is highlighting the value of the alternatives to this process, to this problem. And what we're seeing in Massachusetts, for instance, is the examination of those alternatives. So, as I mentioned, they're undertaking a feasibility analysis of how we might reduce gas demand in ways other than, in kind of non-typical ways. So in the new generation queue, over 50% of the proposed new generation to be built is gas-fired, and then there's a healthy amount of wind that's coming in. The pipes in the west, again, are experiencing periods of higher energy prices with this congestion. And last winter, what happened is that you actually had oil units were running economically for a fair amount of the time. And so, again, right now, we're a little troubled that the region is in this mad rush to socialize the cost of new pipeline infrastructure. We think it may be a little like using a tank to kill a squirrel. And in the interim, the ISO New England in particular has got a winter program right now that's looking to shore up prices in the near term. It's included 1.5 BCF of incremental LNG supply. It's included incentives for oil-fired generators to make sure that their oil tanks are full. There's been a small program for demand response, and a number of pipelines are in the process of going through the permitting process at FERC. So I'm racing the clock here somewhat. Let me go into some of these. This is all captured on one slide. Given these constraints, given these issues, we're attracting a lot of attention in New England for new pipeline and transmission proposals. The Algonquin incremental market expansion proposed by Spectra is actually going to be built and is going to bring an additional 340 million cubic feet of natural gas pipeline capacity into the region. Kinder Morgan has an expansion of about 80 million cubic feet a day. So we're at nearly half a BCF, or 400 million cubic feet a day of additional capacity that is coming to New England. Some of the other projects that you may have heard about, there is a New England Energy Direct project proposed by, that's the big blue line coming in from the west, by Kinder Morgan. That could be up to 2.2 billion cubic feet a day of additional gas capacity. That's become pretty controversial in particularly western Massachusetts communities. And then some of the other pipeline companies have projects as well. Transmission projects, we have Northeast Utility and Hydro-Quebec joining forces coming from the north with their Northern Pass proposal. There are a number of others proposed by, there's a National Grid line, there's a Transmission Developers Incorporated line, and a potential total of 4 gigawatts of new transmission. Transmission capacity is needed, and new projects will be done for reliability purposes. And so there's a number of those projects in the queue. Importantly, these long-term transmission solutions are being installed, and transmission rates alone are increasing pretty substantially, and you should be aware of that. because there's $5 billion of planned transmission just for reliability, not those projects on the previous slide, but that's yet to hit retail rates. A quick snapshot of stakeholder analysis as this discussion takes place. Basically, if you're a consumer, you're a ratepayer, you're very concerned about rate increases without question, but you're also concerned, particularly on the consumer side, and in some cases vocally opposed to infrastructure projects like the Northern Pass or the Kinder Morgan line. Amongst the New England governors, there's a wide range of opinion. Some of the governors actually are proposing this joint procurement with the idea that they want to crush the natural gas basis. And they think, they agree with this link that as the gas price goes, so goes the power price. But that assumes kind of every other variable remains constant. Others have, in particularly Massachusetts and Connecticut, those states have passed Global Warming Solutions Acts. And as a consequence, they have a real carbon goal that they're trying to meet. And they figure large-scale hydro from Canada can help them meet those goals. The ISO New England is primarily focused with electric reliability. They're concerned about baseload retirements. They have done winter reliability programs, both last winter and for this coming winter. As initially proposed, those payments were supposed to have been paid by electric distribution company customers. FERC actually shifted the burden of that over to retail electricity customers, which is why we had some disruption last year or some increases in bills that were unexpected. This year's program will be somewhat more modest. And longer term, they're working on a suite of rules changes that are likely to mitigate much of this problem going forward. So they have a proposal called Pay for Performance, which is actually going to take a carrot and stick approach with the region's generators. If they perform in tight supply-demand situations, they're going to have an incentive payment. If they do not perform, they're going to be severely penalized. The idea is that basically the poor performers would be paying the high performers, and that shouldn't impact rates. Generators, part of the disconnect amongst these two industries, generator markets are basically 3-year markets. In this region, we have a forward capacity market. It's a 1-year price 3 years ahead. Natural gas infrastructure is financed on 15 and 20-year contracts. So there's just a fundamental disconnect between the ways in which the industries make their returns. It's very difficult. That's a thorny issue that's going to continue to exist, and part of the problem right now. But I think we're just in a period of great transition, and that's some of what's happening here. Pipeline developers, they don't build on spec, so they want the contracts to back up their investments. And while they welcome a subsidized procurement proposal from the governors, you can see how the consumers and ratepayers may have a different perspective on that. Electric distribution companies are kind of in both camps right now. They've got proposals with partners in the transmission arena, as well as one of the projects coming in, a pipeline project, is actually a proposed joint venture between Spectra and Northeast Utilities. So they're playing in all this space. LNG suppliers are advocating peaking solutions versus pipeline solutions that are overbuilt. Again, pipelines are, we have good working relationships with pipelines. The facility never directly connects into both the Tennessee and the Algonquin system. And so the concern that we have on the gas side of our house is that you don't want to overbuild pipeline unnecessarily and subsidize it, because you'll be paying that for 20 years when gas price, nobody would basically predict today what the gas price is going to be in 5, let alone 20 years. And the environmental communities, which have a big voice in this region, as you know, have a skeptical perspective on both large-scale hydro and fracked gas, view neither necessarily as green, and are reluctant to embrace pipelines, hoping that the region accelerates its transition to renewables. Just a couple of concluding thoughts. It's been mentioned, the region is losing some of its baseload conventional non-gas-fired generation, and that's something we need to take very seriously. A lot of renewable energy is also connecting to the grid. It's being done increasingly behind the meter, but it's in the queue of production. It's certainly a force to be reckoned with. What this region really needs is to focus on responsive resources that are likely to increase reliance on variable output resources rather than external region resources. And market participants, and this is very important, are definitely responding to these investment signals. Both the generation community, recent auction results are sending a clear signal that this region is welcoming new investment in generation. And there are a number of market-friendly proposals to both do the pipes and the transmission lines, which again is the best antidote to a socialized cost of those projects. And just to hit it one final time, subsidizing these projects, it's financially significant long-term economic risks of higher rates and higher prices for retail customers. We can get to the same place using better our existing natural gas infrastructure, dual fuel generation, and there are certainly more economic solutions to these short duration gas supply problems. That path preserves both flexibility and allows us to adapt to changing market needs. And I think I have completed this in short time. So I thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to your questions, and it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Jeffrey Levine.
Good job. Good morning to everybody in the room and on the web. I'm glad you decided to spend some time with us this morning. A lot of very good information that's been showed to you already. Let's take a moment to adjust in our chairs and freshen up a little bit. We've been sitting here for a while. I am Jeffrey Levine. I focus on PJM and New York. I thought I would share a few interesting points on infrastructure and let you see how those infrastructure investments and decisions might trickle down to the pricing you see when you are procuring. Some of the slides I'm going to show you are going to be upward trending pressure on price, and some of the slides I'm going to be showing you are going to be downward trending pressure on price. And one of the things that is unique about New York, let me just back up and say one other thing. New York is a neighboring grid to ISO New England, and what we've found is that the ISOs don't act in isolation. What one ISO considers as a laboratory trickles around and is eventually picked up by its neighboring ISOs. I think the New York ISO experience could be relevant. New York ISO is a single state ISO, so unlike ISO New England where there's a lot of coordination between multiple states, you really do have a lot of influence by this one state's leadership on the independent system operator. So going back to 2012, Governor Cuomo decided that New York needed massive investments in transmission and generation, and quite frankly, it was an attempt to suppress electricity and capacity clearing prices with government intervention. I'm not judging it, but it's just described accurately that way. I apologize that the pictures at the bottom of the slide don't show you, but there's a map of New York behind each of those lines and each of those dots. And what this is a proposal. It's not funded, it hasn't been implemented or paid for, but you can see that all it took was the government saying who has a proposal for transmission and who has a proposal for generation, and projects came out of the woodwork. All those lines on the left are the transmission proposals that came forward as good ideas, trying to move power from upstate New York to the load pockets in downstate New York. And on the right, all those dots are generation projects, whether they be renewable projects or thermal generation burning a carbon-based fuel. What you cannot see, and I apologize again for the graphic, in the lower right corner of the right-hand slide is Manhattan. And that's where the biggest concentration of consumption is in New York. There is a breakout which shows probably around 12 generation projects in Queens alone, just to serve New York City. So you have a tremendous amount of interest in responding to a high-priced market, but not without government subsidy in this case. So again, not all of these projects are going to be built, not all these projects will be funded, but when you start throwing around billions of dollars in requests, people will respond. I was thinking of how the New York capacity market is starting to consider changes that would make it closer to its neighbors PJM and ISO New England. Just so you know, currently New York is a capacity market that is based on a 6-month strip with monthly and spot purchases. Very different than a 3-year forward capacity market. Having said that, sometime later this fall, New York ISO is going to release a cost-benefit analysis on transforming its market into a forward capacity market. It's considered it in the past, it's rejected it in the past, but just again, neighboring ISOs try to have similar market designs. New York is going to go through a similar process of considering a forward capacity market. A major question, and this is actually going to be the subject of a technical conference that's gotten the attention of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It'll happen November 6th. A major point is the centralized market in which you have large generation connected by transmission to load pockets adequate to attract investment? Has it worked? Do we have the right kind of generation with the right kind of fuel diversity in the right places to provide the reliable service you all are paying for? It's an open question, and you can imagine where the parties are going to fall in that debate, but that is an active debate that's happening in New York ISO, and I don't think it's limited to New York ISO, but it is very active there now. Reliability Support Services Agreement. It's a mouthful, but what it really means is a generator wants to retire. It's been in the business, it's not making money anymore, and there's a reliability analysis that's done whenever a generator tries to retire, and the reliability analysis says if we lose that generator, we will have reliability problems, violations of our rules for maintaining reliability. So they give that generator a contract. That's what the contract is called, the Reliability Support Services Agreement. In other places, it's called the Reliability Must Run. It's all got different names, but there have been 2 recent contracts, and I only mention them because the size of the units are significant. There's a facility, Danskammer, that was destroyed by Hurricane Sandy, and it was going to be sold for scrap. That was the only value it would generate. And at the last minute, the contract for the scrap metal collectors fell through. Someone came forward and said, how about if I rebuild it, repower it? Well, I'm not going to make any money, but maybe if I get a reliability contract, it'll be worth it. And the impact to New York City is it's going to lower the locational capacity requirements. Less capacity will have to be purchased. But really, the impact to the overall market, and this is something I want you to think about when you think about government interventions when they deem a reliability contract is necessary, is that you have 540 megawatts in the first contract, you have 425 megawatts in the second contract, so you're talking about a gigawatt of uneconomic megawatts bidding in at zero because they're getting all their value from this subsidized contract that the ratepayers are going to pay through a utility wires charge. So you now have a unit that's going to bid zero on energy and it's going to bid zero on capacity because it doesn't need to generate revenues. Now, that might sound good. It's going to suppress prices because you have a generator saying, you can take what I have for free to the market. I think the concern, though, is when you think of a capacity market and what it's for sending an investment signal to ensure resource adequacy so that when these 2 generators do retire eventually and this contract is over, there is some other generator behind them ready to provide service. So there's a debate between price suppression, which is the interest of the governor of New York, and And I'm not saying it's bad, but there's a debate between price suppression and accurate investment signals for a capacity market. Just to conclude on this one slide, a nuclear power plant. And you've heard a lot about nuclear in New England. There's a lot of concern coming up in the Mid-Atlantic and Midwest, where we do have our country's largest groupings of nuclear power plants. And this nuclear power plant in New York, they're basically saying we can't operate economically anymore. So we have a nuclear power plant who has sought a reliability contract, and that is still under deliberation at the State Commission. Again, infrastructure decisions and how they impact market prices. So this is maybe an upward push on pricing. Reserve shortages. So as Andy had mentioned, if we know how much consumption you're going to need and we ask for a little bit of cushion from the generating community just in case we have outages, that cushion is called your reserve margin. So maybe what they're going to do, and this is an active discussion in New York, but it's also active in all the ISOs where you might have facilities, is maybe we need to increase our reserves, and maybe we need to increase the price we charge for energy when we hit a shortage moment. So that in that high winter usage or that high summer usage or some other kind of constraint on the transmission system creates a shortage, maybe prices should spike and reflect that shortage as an investment signal to both sides. The generator community will say, wow, prices really were high enough to support new build, but the load side would also say, prices are high enough that maybe I should consider curtailing right now. And I know that demand response is an important new element. So these are just examples of how New York is looking at increasing reserve requirements in different parts of New York where it's needed, mostly just north of Manhattan, and also increasing the price. There's a lot on this, but it kind of shows the complexity. New York is a long generation market, and so is ISO New England, and so is PJM. But despite having excess generation even beyond what it deemed necessary in its reserve margin, they do a reliability assessment that looks out for 10 years, and most ISOs do this. And the red circles show where there's going to be transmission constraints, and the blue circle shows where there's actually going to be generation limitations that threaten resource adequacy. 2015 is a pretty early date for it to show up. So the red circles have 2015 transmission constraints that could challenge resource adequacy and reliability, and the blue circle, which is a generation focus, and that's, by the way, Manhattan and Westchester County, is 2019. So all of a sudden, a 10-year outlook, which was just a standard reliability test, is showing that we do have constraints and concerns, and we might need transmission and generation projects to resolve that. New York tried to send a more focused price signal to the constrained area. Just this May, a new subzone was created, G, H, I, and J, which are the lower grid subzones for capacity. That sent a higher price signal. That meant consumers in that zone paid more, but it also meant generators got a signal that there will be capacity prices that are high enough to support investment in those areas. So this was New York's attempt to further be granular in its price identification and formation. Distributed energy resources is the new thrust in New York. It's a grand experiment. So if you were to compare this concept with the first slide I told you about with an energy plan that had $1 billion investment seeking transmission and generation projects, New York is also doing an experiment with just the opposite. Not centralized generation, but distributed small-scale generation closer to the load pockets where it's needed, mostly focused on renewable or clean power. And it's really centered around empowering customer consumption and usage patterns. Again, when you throw around $1 billion here and $1 billion there, soon you're talking about real money, as they used to say in Washington, D.C. A $1 billion green bank has been proposed. It hasn't been funded yet beyond $200 million. They're taking money from sources like the existing system benefit charge and the regional greenhouse gas initiative auction money on carbon. So they've got about $163 million. But basically, they're using that money to help fund the deployment of advanced technologies, whether they be meters or inverters, a lot of fancy technical elements that would go behind your meter to help you manage and monitor your consumption. The big proposal, and this is an open debate right now, is a $5 billion clean energy fund. And it would, again, tap existing charges on wires bills to create a mega fund to support not only large-scale renewables, but the current experiment where they're investigating distributed, small-scale renewables. And there's a lot of debate. I won't go through each of the slides, but you can see some pretty lofty goals on the bottom bullet, an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So distributed energy resources. There is an open investigation. It's been going on for about 7 months. It'll probably continue for another year. And it's basically going to try to animate the consumer. I've heard the chair of the New York Public Service Commission say, she probably doesn't want this quoted too much, but in the future, your smart refrigerator will be providing ancillary services to the grid. It's kind of hard to imagine, but I think what they're talking about is technological advancements and software and equipment to integrate your consumption, even providing services back to the grid. So on the left, this image is today's central generation portfolio. You have massive generators connected to consumption. On the right is a vision of the building, the facility, even a home that has solar or fuel cells or microturbines or wind, either on-site or nearby and electrically interconnected, and providing that service so you can curtail when you want to and you can use when you want to. You're actually going to be selling these services back to the ISO potentially. So in a nutshell, just to wrap up, I think New York, as an example, and you see this in PJM and to some degree in ISO New England, is doing certain government interventions that might look to put downward pressure on pricing. I think we heard some of those ideas mentioned by Joe in New England. And yet there are other elements that are clearly focused on price formation, which is how do we get the right price signal, aka a higher price signal in the energy market and the capacity market, so that we have resource adequacy. I look forward to your questions. I wanted to keep it short with that, and thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Andy, Jeffrey, and Joe. We are going to start our Q&A session. I think we've probably got about 15 minutes for both online questions and those in the room. For people in the room who have a question, Christine Roback has a microphone. She's our director of key accounts, so she'll be walking around with the microphone. I think we have
These are from the web.
some questions already from the web that we can start with. For those who don't, if you're online and you don't already know, if you click the green Q&A button on the lower left-hand side of your screen, type in your question and hit the ask button, your question will be sent through. As a reminder, we have Jeremy Lowe, who's our Director of Supply for the Northeast, on the panel to help answer any of our questions. So let's see what we've got so far. Online, was there any follow-up after the January 14 polar vortex regarding market design elements, capacity, or energy?
Can I take them?
Yeah. Jeffrey?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. You know, this January saw the highest winter peak in New York as it did in PJM. I'm not sure about ISO New England. It forced the ISOs to consider winter needs. Most of the systems are built on summer peaks, and now all of a sudden they had to consider winter performance. The biggest problems were fuel delivery and fuel storage, whether it be getting gas to the plants or having backup oil. You could imagine having backup oil, 5 days worth of generation fuel, and then all of a sudden you're looking for replacement oil, and the oil delivery companies only have so many trucks and they have so many places to go, and there was a real concern with fuel delivery there. I think the biggest things that are coming out of the polar vortex is a consideration of raising the energy bid cap. Currently, all three markets, ISO New England, New York, and PJM, have a $1,000 per megawatt hour energy bid cap as a generator. That's the most you could try to sell it for. PJM is in an active discussion about raising that $1,000 to, it could be $1,200, $1,500, $1,800. I've seen $2,200. So that's significant. New York has said that they're not going to initiate that kind of discussion, but they will follow. So I've heard PJM say they're going to file something at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in spring of 2015. So you should anticipate other ISOs investigating what to do around a higher energy bid cap. And the other thing that came out of the polar vortex was, and I think it was Joe that mentioned it, the performance incentive for capacity. You really had a lot of outages that were unexpected during January of 2014. And each ISO, I think ISO New England led the way, are coming up with their own, how do we incentivize performance during these critical days, and how do we punish non-performance. PJM is in the thrust of coming up with something that's a close relative to ISO New England, but not exact. They'll file that for the FERC's consideration in December, and New York ISO just last week said, hey, we're going to look at performance incentives as well. Don't know what the details will be, but those are the two main follow-ups from the polar vortex.
Tim, if I may.
Sure.
I'd actually, I give ISO New England credit because they had a program before the polar vortex and had, in anticipation of a difficult winter, had actually put together a program called the Winter Reliability Program. It allowed oil-fired generators to procure basically replenishment, fill-ups and replenishment of their tanks. It was credited with, from a reliability perspective, helping New England weather any additional constraints. It was intended to be a one-year program, but after the experience of the previous winter, they decided to do another program, and I described in brief detail some of that. In addition to oil, and they've changed the structure. So initially they had done the program so that folks would be paid to fill the tanks. Now what they've done is on oil, they're paying for any unused inventory. So they've said to the oil-fired generators, go out, procure oil, tell us what you're buying. If you've got stuff left in the tank at the end, you'll get a $18 per barrel payment for that. On LNG, they said go out, secure contracts for LNG, and if you have unused volumes at the end of the season, you'll get $3 per MMBTU. They paid for generators who were dual fuel units to commission their dual fuel capability, and they did a small program on demand response. It's expected, they were instructed by FERC when they got this program approved, that they will have to do a more market-friendly program to bridge the gap between now and when the initial batch of incremental pipeline expansion comes online.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Andy?
I add to that also. I think two or three things are important to emphasize. One is that there's no question that there's been a response both at the FERC level and at each individual RTO. FERC has held a number of conferences. Each of the RTOs has been active. One thing that's important to emphasize is that what the RTOs are focused on is reliability, that is keeping the lights on. They are not necessarily focused on avoiding prolonged periods of very high prices. And so as buyers, in terms of evaluating your price exposure, it's very important to be aware of that. Essentially, the near-term solution that is likely to make the biggest contribution from a reliability standpoint is what you've heard both Jeffrey and Joe refer to in terms of providing backup fuel oil capability. And there's no question that needs to be done, but it's also important to recognize that as soon as we're in a situation in which oil-fired generation is on the margins, essentially we're talking about prices that are likely to be in at least the $150 to $200 per megawatt hour range. And so what these various measures do is basically they do reduce the risk of the lights going out, and they also should reduce the frequency and severity of ultra-high price spikes, like the day that it went to $400 per megawatt hour. They don't necessarily provide much protection against prices being at quite a high level for most of the winter time frame. Indeed, they may, in fact, to some degree, substantially increase costs that customers pay. And the last thing that I want to emphasize is that I think while we're all hopeful that these solutions will be implemented and they'll be implemented quickly, the track record is that it usually takes a long time, it often takes a long time for the regulatory commissions to evolve towards an efficient solution to these problems. And in that respect, I'd give ISO New England as an example, because essentially the problem of recognizing that in the winter months there may not be enough pipeline capacity in order to bring enough natural gas into New England to serve both space heating demand and power sector demand has been around for a very long time. For those of you who go to the tour of Everett Terminal this afternoon, the reason why there's still natural gas, LNG, being brought into the Everett Terminal is that it was recognized in the 1990s that in the Boston area there was a need for more electric generation. It was recognized that the most efficient solution was to build more natural gas-fired capacity. In fact, there were 2 or 3 units built, Mystic, is it 7, 8, and 9, or just 8 and 9?
8 and 9.
8 and 9 were built, but it was recognized that for them to have reliable fuel supply, they had to enter into long-term LNG purchase agreements to bring in gas through the Everett terminal to supply those plants on a long-term basis. Because it was recognized really 15 years ago that this core problem, the dimensions were a little bit different 15 years ago, but basically this core problem was recognized 15 years ago. I remember recalling studies, reading studies by a very good consulting firm called Levitan in 2004 and 2005 that highlighted this problem. And when ISO New England finally responded, they responded really to the price spikes 2 years ago. And said this ought to be a concern in terms of continued exposure to risk.
Do you have
Okay,
any
thanks.
questions in the room? Does anyone have a question? Okay, we have a few
Yeah,
from the
we have
web.
some more here. So,
Oh, actually, here we have a question.
This winter in New England, without Salem Harbor and Vermont Yankee going down, at what outside temperature do you see these price spikes happen? Is it 30 degrees, 25 degrees, or has anyone looked into temperature versus price spikes?
Yes, and actually if you email me, I'll give you some specific data. It's basically, if I'm recalling correctly, that the threshold in which congestion occurs is gone from something like 36 HDDs to 33 HDDs. I think that's an average temperature of about 32.
we have a couple more questions here online that we'd like to get to. We have time, Suzanne? Okay. First one, what is your energy outlook after next month's election results are determined?
Well, this is energy in Washington.
Anybody have an opinion on what's going to happen after the election, whether prices will fall back off or climb?
Personally, I'm really a believer that basically it's a combination of supply, demand fundamentals, and market design that drive prices. And I don't see even assuming that control over the Senate shifts from Democrats to Republicans, I don't really see that affecting either, or really necessarily at all, certainly for a long time.
Okay.
I would observe that not so much on prices, but in New England, there is, again, starting nearly a year ago, there was this joint statement a notion that there was going to be a joint procurement of resource, and at least 2 of the 6 New England governors will be different on November 5th. It's conceivable that 4 of the governors will be different on November 6th. So the manner, and some of the state legislatures, et cetera, so it will probably have an impact on those discussions. It's a little too early to tell yet what the proclivities will be of the various folks who are elected, but I think it's safe to say it will have an impact of some kind.
Tim, I think it's a great question because it really highlights the point that there are so many complex drivers in the energy markets. So I think it points to the caveats that we can present with regard to the things presented this morning. Things like the U.S. economy being a big player, whether we have a contraction or expansionary economy as the administrations will change, and perhaps any regulation to shale gas. That would be a large caveat, very big game changer. Reversals to any of the policies we've talked about, whether they be with regard to shale, pipelines, distributed generation. So I think we are entering a time of increased uncertainty. And all that translates into is higher volatility. So as procurement managers, as buyers of power, I very much commiserate with the challenges you all have in front of you. It's very tough to sit here and digest 2 hours worth of information on very complex issues, the regulatory policies, the supply and demand of gas, what it does to the forward curve. And what it speaks to really is having a disciplined buying plan going into a budget cycle and even 12 to 24 months out. Because when we talk about being a procurement manager, you're talking about being a risk manager. And risk is really your exposure to uncertainty. And if we haven't highlighted anything succinctly, we can say that there's a lot of uncertainty out there. We know that. And so if you have a lot of exposure in the next 6 months to prices, you very much want to reduce your exposure. And you want to also take advantage of the time horizon that you have by purchasing and hedging through a disciplined buying program over time. So I think it's a great question because it points to the caveats. There are game changers out there. And regulation can change. The coin can be flipped. And this time next year, we could be talking about other big factors that have changed the marketplace.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. I have one other question here that came online that I think is a good question to address. Is what products, or given in light of all of the complexities and challenges in front of us, what products or strategies do you recommend for customers given the volatility in the market?
Yeah, I think most of the time when we talk to our customers, our clients, they have a focus on either getting to a certain budget number or beating that budget number. And I think that's a very good goal to have. I think that's a very challenging one. I think one that everyone in this room deals with on a day-to-day basis. I think a fixation on getting a price target is very difficult. The energy markets are multiple times more volatile than the equity markets. And so if you can't predict what the Dow Jones will do, I can't either. I think it's very difficult for you or I to predict what Mass Hub will do or New York Zone J. So then it becomes a plan of when do I want to buy power and do I want to do it ratably over time? I think a fixed price product is one that a lot of people are comfortable with because it provides some budget certainty. But taking that a little bit further, buying a fixed price product over time and being disciplined to a plan of, at this price, I really will lock down that contract because it's a good price and meets budget, and not getting too greedy if we see markets dip a little bit. And we might, like Andy mentioned, the weather reports for November and December look favorable in New England and New York. Most of the weather reports we look at show that it will be slightly warmer than normal. We've already seen a lot of the premium come out of the prices since the summertime. That said, in January and February, most of the reports are showing a slightly colder than normal winter, January, February. So waiting until January, February, probably not a good idea because you'll be exposed to price spikes. So a lot of you are probably familiar with our Easy Flex product. It's our product where you can buy a load following shaped product, but buy different percentages over time. That really lets you cost average. You're not buying power with one bullet. You're buying it with several bullets, so you buy it over time. Products like that, products like a stipulated quantity block, allow you to cost average as well. And so having a plan, setting targets for the low side and the high side at which you're comfortable, understanding your risk appetite. These are the things that you need to be thinking about and that you do think about, and then sticking to the plan, even when prices drop, and then for sure when prices rise.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else have any input? Thank you. Any other questions in the room? All right, well, yes, we got one here. Great.
I just saw earlier today you had a slide showing the projected projects that are coming on the horizon for both pipeline and electrical coming into New England. I just wondered, that slide showed nothing being completed and being brought online before 2016, 2017, and going out as far as 2020. What do you feel like, assuming all of those projects are completed on time, and how do you feel that that's going to affect because demand is continuously rising as well, so what do you see going forward as far as demand in relation to all of those projects being completed?
So there's been a lot of analysis of this to date. I think that demand, it kind of depends on where you are. In Connecticut, for instance, there's been a big initiative. There's been a comprehensive energy proposal that was became law a year ago, and really one of the main goals was to move residential home heating oil folks off of oil and onto natural gas. So there you have a pocket of demand. The Algonquin incremental market expansion that Spectra has proposed is really kind of on the front edge of serving that load, that growing load pocket. Traditionally, what's happened with respect to natural gas expansion is that you have a growing volume of customers that want to sign up for residential home heating service, and the curve is like a sawtooth. So basically, demand goes up and up and up and up, and then you build a slug of pipeline to accommodate the demand, and then the whole process starts over again. And I think some of that is still taking place right now. And these projects are going to accommodate that. What's happening in terms of the regional discussion is that you have folks who say, look, if I'm a local distribution company and you're a home heating customer, I'm obligated to sell you first and primary. If I sell you all that I have, this power generator over here can't get any. So some of this is going to be dependent upon whether or not there's really a bridging of the gap between these two industries to allow generators to contract in a more firm basis for pipeline capacity or for liquefied natural gas, for instance. So part of what the facility in Everett does is vaporizes liquid gas, puts it into the pipeline coming from the east to the west. And so long as folks can accommodate their needs in terms of signing up for product, this should be okay, and the pipes will grow incrementally, but according to only the demand that's out there. So the big risk is that if we have an overbuilt system, you're really going to be in a situation where you're paying for that capacity without necessarily needing it 330 days of the year.
What I want to emphasize, consistent with what Joe's just said, is that it's really not total demand for electricity that's governing what happens with prices in New England. It's much more total need to use natural gas that's dominating prices. And we essentially had more of a need to use natural gas last winter than we had the ability to supply natural gas to New England, and that's what caused the price spikes. And because of these retirements on the power side, retirements of coal and nuclear, and because of the growth that's occurring in residential natural gas, demand for natural gas, the amount of natural gas that we need in New England is going to expand every year at a fairly rapid rate. And the pipeline additions that will occur will only cover part of that. So we need to have the ones that are already committed, will only cover part of that. So we need to have a solution one way or the other to provide more natural gas to New England. And what Joe's argued, I think fairly persuasively, is that there are really two ways to meet that need. One is to build more pipelines bringing natural gas into New England, but another is to take advantage of the unique opportunity that exists because of the existence of the Everett terminal to store natural gas at the Everett terminal as LNG, and then when needed to vaporize that and inject it into the pipeline system. And there are both ways of getting more gas into the system, but one or both are going to be needed.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say real quick, so these demands are kind of growing at the same pace. So in other words, even if you say I'm a resident that wants to switch over, you can only really do that if it's on your street, right? So there'll be a certain amount of that, but there are going to be neighborhoods where those local distribution pipes don't exist yet. That's going to match up more in line with the development of the pipe. If you said today, I'm going to build a natural gas power plant today, I'm making that announcement, it's not going to be built for 3 years. So, I mean, there's going to be some syncing of the demand with the supply that comes online. Sorry.
If I could just quickly complement what's been said. As new transmission, new pipeline, new generation come online, whether they are ratepayer subsidized or independent business decisions, you will see a short-term suppression of the clearing price. But with that low clearing price, you're not going to see a signal for anyone else to then build, and then you just wait for scarcity, and then you'll see a spike in prices. So if your question is, how does it impact prices? It does impact prices, but it's not clear how and over what period of time. You might see a very short term, like price suppression, and then you might see no one else going to build there, demand increases, and now you have a shortage, and then it means prices spike.
Now, the really key point, you really asked a great question, is that most of the measures that are being considered really won't have any impact for 3 or 4. Most of the measures that could lower prices won't have any impact for at least 3 or 4 years, and it could be longer. On paper, they could have a major impact by then if they're built, but then we have this other set of problems that I described in terms of the explosion of demand for natural gas nationally that could create a different set of price risks. So it's really, throughout the rest of the decade, is potentially a very risky period, and we're advising people we consult with that, going out 5 years to cover some of your requirements may make sense to try to reduce your exposure to these risks.
Okay, well, thanks, everybody. And again, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us here today and joining us online. I think we're going to wrap it up at this point. Hopefully, we've learned a lot. There's a lot of discussion and obviously a lot of complexity in this market, in both of these markets, with issues that are going to be important to us for the next several years. So hopefully we're generating some further discussion and questions. I would like to point out that if you could, please engage with us on social media, whether it be LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook. For every time you hit on one of those social sites, we will donate $1 to the Connecticut Children's Medical Center, in addition to the $3,000 that we've donated this month. So hit us early and often so we can maximize these efforts for a great cause. We will be making this available. We'll email this link to this entire program, including the decks, here as soon as it's available. If you're joining us to go to the Everett terminal, I think probably 5 minutes from now, right, Suzanne? We should meet at the desk here where we checked in. Okay? Thanks again, everybody, for joining us.